Have you ever looked at your cherry tree in spring and thought, this is going to be the year? The branches are covered in stunning blossoms, the tree appears healthy, the leaves are vibrant, and everything seems to be going exactly as nature intended. But then, as the weeks pass, something disappointing happens. The blossoms fall, summer arrives, and instead of clusters of beautiful cherries, you're left with nothing, or perhaps just a few tiny fruits that never mature. If this sounds familiar, you're certainly not alone. Every year, thousands of home gardeners wonder why their cherry trees refuse to produce fruit despite looking perfectly healthy. It's frustrating, especially after spending years watering, pruning, fertilizing, and caring for the tree. Here's the good news. In most cases, a cherry tree that isn't producing fruit is trying to tell you something. Once you understand how cherry trees actually develop fruit, the mystery becomes much easier to solve. Often, the problem isn't the tree itself but one or two hidden factors that many gardeners overlook. In today's video, we're going to uncover every major reason why cherry trees fail to produce fruit. And, more importantly, how to fix each one. By the end of this guide, you'll know exactly what to check, what mistakes to avoid, and what steps can dramatically improve your harvest in future seasons. Before discussing the problems, it's important to understand how a cherry tree produces fruit in the first place. Many people assume that blossoms automatically become cherries. While that sounds logical, nature is much more complicated than that. Producing fruit is actually a chain of successful events, and if even one link in that chain is broken, your harvest can disappear completely. The process begins long before spring arrives. During late summer and early autumn of the previous year, your cherry tree starts forming flower buds for the following season. Throughout winter, these buds remain dormant while the tree conserves energy. As temperatures begin to rise in spring, the buds swell and eventually open into beautiful blossoms. At this point, many gardeners think the hard work is over. In reality, the most critical stage is only beginning. Each blossom has only a limited amount of time to be successfully pollinated. If pollination fails, the flower simply drops without producing fruit. Even successful pollination doesn't guarantee a harvest. The newly formed fruit must continue developing, receive enough nutrients and water, survive unfavorable weather, avoid diseases and insect damage, and remain attached to the tree until maturity. Any interruption along this journey can leave you with an empty tree. That's why experienced fruit growers rarely judge a cherry tree by how many flowers it produces. Instead, they focus on how many flowers become healthy fruit. Now let's examine the first, and perhaps the most overlooked, reason cherry trees fail to bear fruit. The first reason is simply age. This surprises many new gardeners because young cherry trees often look vigorous and healthy. They grow rapidly, produce beautiful leaves, and sometimes even flower heavily. Yet year after year, there are still no cherries. The explanation is simple. A young tree is still investing most of its energy into building a strong root system, developing its trunk, and forming a sturdy branch structure. Fruit production requires enormous amounts of energy, and nature wisely prioritizes growth before reproduction. Exactly how long this takes depends on the type of tree. Cherry trees grown from nursery grafts often begin producing fruit between 3 and 5 years after planting, although some varieties require 6 or even 7 years before reaching reliable production. Trees grown from seed are a completely different story. Many people plant pits from delicious cherries, hoping to grow the same fruit at home. While this is an enjoyable project, seed-grown cherry trees often need 7 to 10 years, or even longer, before producing fruit. Some may never produce fruit identical to the original cherry because seeds do not grow true to their parent variety. If your tree is still young, patience may be the only solution. There's no fertilizer, pruning technique, or miracle product that can force an immature cherry tree to fruit before it's biologically ready. However, if your tree is already mature and still isn't producing cherries, it's time to investigate other causes. The second major reason involves something that many gardeners don't even realize exists: the difference between self-fertile and self-sterile cherry varieties. This single factor explains countless disappointing harvests and is one of the biggest reasons a tree can bloom beautifully every spring yet never produce fruit. Now let's continue with one of the most common reasons cherry trees fail to produce fruit: poor pollination. This is where many gardeners become confused. They see hundreds, sometimes thousands, of blossoms covering the tree. Bees are flying around the garden, everything looks healthy, and yet just a few weeks later, nearly every flower has disappeared without producing a single cherry. How is that possible? The answer lies in understanding that flowering and pollination are two completely different things. A flower is only an opportunity to produce fruit. Until pollen is successfully transferred to the right flower at exactly the right time, that blossom cannot develop into a cherry. One of the biggest misconceptions among home gardeners is believing that every cherry tree can pollinate itself. In reality, many popular sweet cherry varieties are self-sterile. This means they cannot fertilize their own flowers, even if the tree is completely covered in blossoms. Instead, they require pollen from another compatible cherry variety that blooms at the same time. Imagine trying to complete a puzzle with only half the pieces. Everything may appear ready, but one essential component is missing. Without a suitable pollinating tree nearby, thousands of flowers may bloom beautifully only to fall to the ground a few days later. This is why some gardeners plant a single cherry tree and wait for years without harvesting fruit, while their neighbor enjoys baskets full of cherries every summer. The difference often isn't better soil or better fertilizer. It's simply the presence of a compatible pollinator. If you aren't sure whether your cherry tree is self-fertile, check the original plant label or look up the variety online. Knowing the exact cultivar can immediately answer one of the biggest questions about fruit production. Fortunately, not every cherry tree has this problem. Many sour cherries are naturally self-fertile, meaning they can produce fruit without another tree nearby. Several modern sweet cherry varieties have also been bred to be self-fertile, making them excellent choices for smaller gardens where space is limited. However, even self-fertile trees often produce larger crops when another compatible cherry tree is growing nearby. More successful pollination usually means more cherries. But having two trees still doesn't guarantee success. Pollination depends heavily on insects. Honeybees, bumblebees, mason bees, and many native pollinators carry pollen from flower to flower throughout the blooming period. Without them, fruit production drops dramatically. Unfortunately, bee activity is strongly influenced by the weather. If temperatures remain too cold, bees stay inside their hives. If it's windy, they fly much less. Heavy rain can almost completely stop pollination because insects avoid flying during storms, and rain can wash pollen away before it reaches another flower. Sometimes a cherry tree experiences a full week of rainy, cold weather during bloom. The flowers open normally, but almost no pollination takes place. By the time sunshine returns, many blossoms have already passed their fertile stage. As a result, the tree finishes blooming with almost no fruit beginning to develop. This situation frustrates gardeners because the tree appears perfectly healthy. The real problem occurred during just a few critical days that often went unnoticed. Another hidden enemy is the late spring frost. Cherry blossoms are surprisingly delicate. Although the tree itself can survive freezing winter temperatures, open flowers are much more vulnerable. A single night with temperatures below freezing during bloom can damage the reproductive parts inside the flowers. From a distance, everything may still look beautiful. The petals remain white. The branches appear full of blossoms. But inside the flower, the tiny structures responsible for producing fruit may already be dead. A few days later, those blossoms quietly fall from the tree without forming cherries. Many gardeners mistakenly blame insects, fertilizer, or watering, never realizing the damage happened during one cold night. If you suspect frost damage, carefully inspect recently opened flowers. Healthy flower centers are usually light green or pale yellow. Flowers damaged by freezing temperatures often develop dark brown or black centers. That discoloration is one of the clearest signs that frost destroyed the future fruit. Professional growers sometimes protect blossoms using frost cloths, wind machines, orchard heaters, or overhead irrigation systems that prevent flower tissues from dropping below critical temperatures. Most home gardeners don't have access to those methods, but planting cherry trees in locations protected from frost pockets can greatly reduce the risk. Avoid planting trees in low areas where cold air naturally settles overnight. Even a small difference in elevation can determine whether blossoms survive or freeze. If pollination was successful and frost didn't destroy the flowers, you might expect a heavy crop to follow. Yet many gardeners still watch tiny cherries appear only to fall from the tree a few weeks later. Why would a healthy tree begin producing fruit and then suddenly drop nearly all of it? The answer involves nutrition, watering, pruning, and the tree's ability to support its developing crop. If your cherry tree successfully bloomed, the flowers were pollinated, and tiny green cherries actually began to develop, you probably thought the hardest part was over. Unfortunately, this is another stage where many gardeners lose their entire harvest. One day the tree is covered with small fruit, and a week later the ground beneath it is littered with tiny cherries. Sometimes only a few remain. Other times, every single one falls before reaching full size. This can be discouraging, but it doesn't always mean something is seriously wrong. In fact, cherry trees naturally shed some developing fruit every year. This process, often called June drop in many regions, is the tree's way of balancing its resources. If more cherries begin developing than the tree can realistically support, it sacrifices part of the crop so the remaining fruit has enough water, nutrients, and energy to mature properly. A light fruit drop is perfectly normal. However, when nearly all the cherries fall, it's usually a sign that another problem is placing the tree under stress. One of the biggest causes is inconsistent watering. Cherry trees dislike extremes. Soil that stays constantly waterlogged can suffocate the roots, reducing their ability to absorb oxygen and nutrients. On the other hand, allowing the soil to become extremely dry during flowering or early fruit development places the tree into survival mode. When moisture becomes limited, the tree makes a simple biological decision. Instead of investing precious resources into producing fruit, it redirects its energy toward keeping the trunk, branches, and leaves alive. The developing cherries are sacrificed first. Many gardeners accidentally create this cycle by watering heavily only after the soil has become bone dry. Deep watering is beneficial, but consistency is even more important. Rather than giving the tree large amounts of water once every few weeks, it's usually better to maintain steady soil moisture, especially during flowering and fruit development. Mulching can make a tremendous difference. A layer of organic mulch around the base of the tree helps regulate soil temperature, reduces evaporation, suppresses weeds, and keeps moisture levels more stable throughout the growing season. Just remember to keep mulch several inches away from the trunk to prevent moisture buildup against the bark. Another common mistake involves fertilizer. Many people believe that if a tree isn't producing fruit, feeding it more fertilizer will solve the problem. Ironically, the opposite often happens. Excess nitrogen encourages vigorous leaf and branch growth. The tree becomes lush, green, and beautiful, but its energy is directed toward producing vegetation instead of flowers and fruit. If your cherry tree produces long, vigorous shoots every year but very few blossoms, excessive nitrogen could be the reason. This frequently occurs when lawns surrounding fruit trees receive high nitrogen fertilizer. The grass benefits, but the cherry tree absorbs much of that fertilizer as well. Instead of preparing flower buds for the following season, it continues producing leafy growth. Balanced fertilization is essential. Cherry trees require nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and numerous micronutrients. Too little nutrition weakens the tree. Too much of one nutrient creates a different imbalance. Whenever possible, base fertilizer applications on a soil test rather than guesswork. A simple soil analysis can reveal nutrient deficiencies, pH problems, and other hidden issues that aren't visible by looking at the tree. Speaking of pH, many gardeners never consider the chemistry of their soil. Even when nutrients are present, roots cannot efficiently absorb them if the soil pH falls outside the preferred range. Cherry trees generally perform best in slightly acidic to neutral soil. If the soil becomes too acidic or too alkaline, important nutrients may become unavailable, even though they are technically present in the ground. That's why adding more fertilizer doesn't always solve the problem. The nutrients may simply be locked away. Sunlight is another factor that deserves careful attention. Cherry trees are sun-loving plants. To produce abundant flowers and high-quality fruit, they need plenty of direct sunlight throughout the day. Trees growing in heavy shade often remain healthy enough to survive but produce very few blossoms. Even partial shading from nearby buildings or larger trees can reduce flowering over time. If your cherry tree receives only a few hours of direct sunlight each day, limited light could be one of the main reasons you're seeing little or no fruit. Pruning also plays a surprisingly important role. Many gardeners assume that the more branches they remove, the healthier the tree will become. Unfortunately, excessive pruning can dramatically reduce fruit production. Cherry trees develop many of their flower buds on older wood or on short fruiting spurs that remain productive for several years. If those fruiting branches are removed every winter, the tree spends the next growing season replacing lost wood instead of producing cherries. Timing matters just as much. Heavy pruning at the wrong time of year stimulates vigorous vegetative growth, which delays fruit production even further. The goal isn't to remove as many branches as possible. Instead, focus on improving air circulation, removing damaged or diseased wood, and maintaining a strong, open canopy that allows sunlight to reach all parts of the tree. Every cut should have a purpose. If you're unsure whether you're pruning correctly, remember this simple rule. Never prune simply because you think the tree looks too full. Prune because a branch has a specific reason to be removed. Even after correcting watering, fertilization, sunlight, and pruning, some cherry trees continue struggling. Why? Because invisible enemies may already be attacking the tree. Certain insects feed on flowers, developing fruit, leaves, or roots, while diseases can weaken the tree long before obvious symptoms appear. Recognizing those hidden threats early often makes the difference between a disappointing season and a tree loaded with healthy cherries. By now, you've learned that poor pollination, unfavorable weather, improper watering, excessive fertilizer, lack of sunlight, and incorrect pruning can all prevent a cherry tree from producing fruit. But what if you've addressed all of those issues and your tree still refuses to reward you with a good harvest? At that point, it's time to look for the hidden enemies that often go unnoticed until serious damage has already been done. Many insect pests are so small that gardeners don't realize they are present until fruit production has already declined. Some insects attack flower buds before they even open. Others feed on blossoms during the short flowering period. Still others target the developing fruit itself. Even if only a small percentage of flowers are damaged, your final harvest can be dramatically reduced. One of the first places to inspect is the underside of the leaves. Tiny colonies of aphids are a common problem on cherry trees. Although aphids don't usually destroy an entire crop by themselves, they feed by sucking sap from young shoots and leaves, weakening new growth and causing leaves to curl. Heavy infestations can reduce the tree's overall vigor, making it more difficult to support developing fruit. You may also notice a sticky substance called honeydew on the leaves or branches. This sugary residue often leads to black sooty mold, which blocks sunlight from reaching the leaves, and further reduces the tree's ability to produce energy through photosynthesis. Another common issue is boring insects. Unlike aphids, which feed openly on leaves, borers tunnel beneath the bark. Their damage can interrupt the movement of water and nutrients between the roots and the canopy. In severe cases, entire branches begin declining for no obvious reason. If you notice small holes in the trunk, sawdust-like material around the bark, or branches that suddenly wilt while the rest of the tree appears healthy, borers could be responsible. Diseases are another major factor. Cherry trees are susceptible to several fungal and bacterial infections that interfere with flowering and fruit production. One of the most recognizable problems is brown rot. This disease often begins during flowering. Infected blossoms suddenly wilt, turn brown, and remain